here with Pepper and Dottie, and we're going to read chapter 6 of Who Was George Washington Carver? Tuskegee. The city of Tuskegee and the surrounding area turned out to be an amazing place. George found many new plants and flowers to study. The school itself, however, wasn't so amazing. When George arrived, he had no rooms in which to store his collections, and not even a laboratory in which to work. But George didn't worry about what he didn't have. Use what you find around you, he told his first students. He took them to a junkyard. They dug up old pots and pans, saucers and spoons, boxes and string, whatever they could find, and made their own laboratory. It was all part of hands-on learning for George's students. He didn't want to just stand in front of his classroom and give lectures. He wanted his students to touch and feel nature and to think. On early morning walks, George collected samples of soil or flowers or insects that he shared in his classroom. Outside the classroom, he set up a practice farm on 10 acres of land. It was an experiment station. 1 acre was for testing the soil. Another was for growing sweet potatoes. Another for studying fertilizers, and so on. With the experiment station, George took his wish to be the greatest good to the greatest number seriously. He invited local farmers to come to the school once a month to learn about the soil. During their monthly meetings, George analyzed the farmers' soil and gave them samples of his. Then he started encouraging them to come in between the monthly meetings whenever they needed some help. Then he invited the wives to come along too. He showed them ways to plan meals and prep food, and he discussed the value of different foods. George didn't have the money for fancy equipment at Tuskegee, so his advice was helpful to the farmers who didn't have the money for fancy equipment either. George wanted farmers to pay attention to nature and all it had to offer. He wrote different booklets that taught how to grow tomatoes, or raise hogs, or preserve meat. The more farmers could do on their own, the less they had to spend at the market, and the less they had to go without. Anything that fills the dinner pail is valuable, he said. He wrote other booklets that helped farmers improve the appearance of their land and their homes. He knew they couldn't afford to buy paint, but he also knew there were plenty of natural resources. Different types of natural clay, for instance, could be mixed to make different colors for paint. With a little glue mixed in, it would stick to cabin walls. George also taught farmers how to care for native plants, flowers, and grasses, and how to fix up their homes. Such a work schedule, though, was exhausting. George liked to get up by 4 o'clock in the morning and walk in the woods. No, thank you. Then he taught 4 or 5 classes each day. He also ran the experiment station and worked in the homemade laboratory. He continued to paint and draw too, and he often wrote letters to Moses and Susan Carver and to the other families he had lived with. He also organized a Bible study class once a week. His intense workload and many interests left George little times for fun. Sometimes his friends set him up on dates, but he never married. In 1906, George designed the Jessup agricultural wagon. It was a movable classroom and portable laboratory. The Jessup wagon was named for a New York banker, Morris K. Jessup, who helped pay for it. A former student of George's was in charge of taking the wagon to faraway farmers who couldn't make it to Tuskegee. The wagon was loaded with soil, seeds, booklets, and other study materials. In 1908, George had the chance to visit Moses, who had moved to Kansas after Susan's death several years earlier. It would be the last time George saw his foster father. Moses Carver died in his late 90s in 1910. 5 years after losing his father, George also lost his friend Booker T. Washington. Booker was 59 when he died of heart failure in 1915. George and Booker didn't always agree on how things should be run at Tuskegee, but they were close friends. I am sure Mr. Washington never knew how much I loved him and the cause for which he gave his life, George wrote another friend. Booker T. Washington had been the face of the Tuskegee Institute since the school opened its doors. After his death, Robert Russia Mouton became president of Tuskegee, but it was George who became the most famous person at the school.